Behavioural economics on a post-it number 32. Boosts and Nudge Plus. In this video, I'm just going to talk very briefly about two additional behavioural public policy frameworks that differ somewhat from those that I've presented in earlier videos. Both of these frameworks really aim to try to ensure people think for themselves, and by doing so may be able to make better decisions for themselves. So if you just ignore the diagram at the top just for a moment, I'm just going to describe very, very briefly what boosts and then Nudge Plus is. Now, boosts are associated mostly with the work of Ralph Hertwig and Gert Gigerenzer. And I think both of those two excellent scholars believe that people find it difficult to comprehend many sort of statistical informations that are presented to them in, say, for example, financial related decisions or medical related decisions, or any decision, I suppose, that requires a degree of complexity in thinking about the implications, particularly statistically, I suspect. But boosts, those that advocate boosts, do not wish to try to circumvent that by discouraging people to think for themselves. They may argue that by using nudges, just changing the choice architecture without sort of explaining fully to people exactly what's going on and just relying on automatic choices to change, kind of undermines the propensity or the motivation for people to think clearly for themselves. So with boost interventions, the idea is that you try to present the information to people much more clearly, much more accessibly, so that they can manage the information as best as they possibly can. If you do that, then you kind of leave it to the individuals themselves. If you're successful in doing that, they might still choose things that they did previously, but at least you'll have a better more confidence that they'll be making more fully informed decisions when they face, sometimes quite profound options or choices in their lives. So that's essentially what you're trying to do with boosting. You're trying to sort of enable people to think more clearly and more fully for themselves by a clearer presentation of the data. And that requires some, obviously it requires a lot of research to find out which presentational formats are most understandable to people, but that's the direction that you go with boosting. With Nudge Plus, originally developed, I think, by Peter John. Peter and his followers believe that, they're worried, I think, that Nudge, for instance, where you just change the choice, similar to boosting, where you change the choice architecture, that you sort of erode people's ability or propensity to think for themselves. And they're worried about that. So what they propose is that beside each nudge intervention that you introduce, you also introduce some kind of explanation, a written explanation perhaps, of what the nudge is doing and what its intentions are. So for example, if you had differential orderings of dessert options on canteen shelves, as we've talked about in previous post-its, where you place the cheesecake at the back and the apples and the other healthier options at the front, then you wouldn't just leave it as a reordering and just get people get on with it. You'd also provide an explanation beside the canteen shelf, perhaps, that explains explicitly what's being done and why it's being done, right? And then people can think then for themselves about whether they want to be affected by the different placements of the various dessert options. That approach possibly does require a lot of effort by individuals, or both those implementing the interventions in order to provide an explanation, and the confidence that a significant number of people are going to read what the interventions are going to, trying to do, if an explanation for it is provided by, beside the intervention. But nonetheless, again, it's an approach that aims to try to get people to think more clearly for themselves than, just trying to, rely upon their automatic decision making without them being given the opportunity to process exactly what's going on around them. Now, what I've just said at the bottom there is that both of these approaches, the advocates of both of these approaches, are concerned with other approaches' propensity to perhaps undermine individual autonomy. They want to try to encourage explicit deliberation from individuals when they're making their choices. Now, if I think about both of these approaches myself, in terms of where we would place them in these kind of three-dimensional diagrams that I've talked about before, I think probably both approaches, not necessarily, but I think both approaches probably mostly focus upon internalities. It seems to me as though the principal direction in both cases is to try to get people to make decisions different decisions in their lives that might be better for those individuals themselves. Both approaches preserve liberty, I believe. I mean, they're not advocating that people should be regulated in particular behavioural options. They're just advocating that people should think more, if you like, about or are given the opportunities to make more informed decisions about the various options that they face in their lives. But they don't have to change their decisions. They can think more and they can process better, but ultimately they might choose the same thing. So it preserves liberty. I think where it differs from, say, the nudge approach is that it's kind of moving a little bit from being purely behaviourally informed. I mean, I think both approaches are concerned that people, if given, simple options that are not explained fully to them, then people might be influenced heavily by the behavioural bias, what are classified as behavioural biases. So in a sense, they are behaviourally informed, behaviourally motivated, but both approaches are trying to get people to think more explicitly and therefore perhaps more rationally about the choices that they face. So both approaches perhaps are trying to move individuals from the behavioural end of the spectrum here, closer to the more sort of rational, deliberative end of the spectrum. Okay, so that's all of the behavioural public policy frameworks that I'm going to cover in these videos. Previous ones I've covered nudge, shove, and budge, and here in Behavioural Economics post-it number 32, I briefly covered boosts and nudge plus.